So transitioning into our last section of today's presentations, I want to welcome Jaja to give her presentation on the subject.
Hey guys, I'm Jaja, or Jaja, and I'm a sophomore at Amherst College, currently double majoring in Fine Arts and American Studies with minors in Asian Pacific American Studies and International Relations. And for my intern project, I taught a summer camp class for a class of 30 high school students called Untold Asian American Histories from the Chinese Massacres to the Yellow Power Movement. And the reason I was interested in doing this and being involved with this organization is because since I was 16, I wanted to become a professor of Asian American Studies, which has been tricky for me because I've had a stutter my whole life, and so if I do stutter today, just bear with me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my inspiration for this project. It was mainly to remedy these 4 gaps that I noticed in education, both through personal experience and some research that I did. So I'm going to go into each one of these gaps a little bit. So the first one is that there's been a history of negative portrayal of APA, or Asian Pacific Americans throughout history. And so when I asked my 30 students what some of these stereotypes were that they had picked up, these were some of their responses that were associated with the model minority, or that we are the model minority, that were ugly, thieves of intellectual property, espoused economic greed, and most of all, that were perpetual foreigners. So the next sort of gap that I noticed is that there's just a general lack of APA content in education. So as of 2018, there's 52 American colleges that offer minors or majors in Asian American Studies. In addition to those 52, there's 18 that offer classes, but not a minor or major program. But in the entire United States, there's 5,300 colleges, which means only 1.3% of American colleges offer Asian American Studies to any extent. Sorry. And so after taking this class, I asked my students sort of what Asian American Studies topics they had learned about in school before taking my class. And 19 of them responded. And I asked them about a variety of topics, but I only included 3 that were relevant to Chinese American history because we are, like the 1882 Foundation. And so 47% of them did not learn about the Chinese Exclusion Acts or the Chinese massacres. Also 47% of them did not learn about the Chinese transcontinental railroad workers, even though they did learn about the Transcontinental Railroad. And then none of them had learned about or even heard about United States versus Wong Kim Ark. The third gap is that there's a lack of role models for these students, like role models that are from their ethnic groups or look like them. So this 2005 study took a look at California's History and Social Studies framework, which consistently pushes 100 American individuals for schools to teach their students as sort of role model figures in a way. And none of these individuals were Asian American, despite California having such a high Asian American population. And lastly, there's obviously continuing implicit and explicit racism against APA. The explicit racism, like hate crimes and usage of derogatory terms, is a lot easier to spot, whereas the implicit racism deals a lot with sort of historical associations between social category, in this case being Asian Americans, and XYZ stereotypes. So what implicit racism would be, for example, because media and education have consistently associated Asian Americans with a certain stereotype, employers, when they see an Asian American person, they might be less likely to hire them because they associate them with that stereotype. So what I think ethnic studies will help do is create a lot more and a lot more diverse associations between Asian Americans and a variety of roles, so that people really learn that Asian Americans are not, that they're not any one thing and that they can be many things. And so I designed my course syllabus and pulled primary sources and content with remedies for these 4 aforementioned gaps in mind. And so I tried to introduce my students to a variety of APA in a diverse variety of roles, like historical figures. And instead of telling APA history as a chronological narration of events, I tried to tell each event from the perspective of certain individuals so that the lessons were more interesting and relevant to the students, and that the students might choose these individuals as sort of role models. And I tried to make the content, lastly, relevant to not just APA, because 50% of my class was not Asian American. So I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about the structure of the classes. So for each class, we'd start with a song by APA, about APA. Some of these were old activist songs from the 60s, some of these are like modern hip hop. And then we would discuss the lyrics as a way to sort of dive into the topic of the day. And then we dive into 30 to 40 minutes of lecture, primary sources and images, and then we'd spend the last 10 minutes watching parts of these 2 TV series with a large Asian American cast and talk about how the characters defied or conform to APA stereotypes. So there's 7 classes total, but we only covered content in 6. The 7th class is actually today, and they're having a substitute sort of wrap up the wrap up the film or the show for them. And so the first class was sort of a survey or like an overview of APA history, and because it's such a long history, I wanted to make it a little bit more palatable for the students. So I used the story of Vincent Chin's family. So I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with Vincent Chin, but he was a Chinese-American man that was lynched in 1982. But the interesting thing is, if we take a look at Vincent's family, we can actually get a glimpse of a solid 200 years of Asian American history. So we started by talking about Vincent Chin's great-grandfather, Mr. Yi, who was a transcontinental railroad worker who actually returned to China because of racism, and he actually warned his granddaughter of this racism. And in exploring Mr. Yi, we learned a little bit about what the conditions were like for Chinese transcontinental railroad workers. And then we went to Vincent Chin's father, who was a Chinese-American soldier in World War II, and talked a little bit about what it was like being Chinese-American in that time and in the aftermath of the Exclusion Acts. And then finally, we talked about Vincent Chin, who grew up during the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War. So we talked about sort of APA experiences during that time, and then finally talked about Vincent's lynching and the Pan-Asian movement that it galvanized. So the next class was on Asian American history before the gold rush and before American independence. So we focused on the Filipino-American settlers in the 16th century. The third class was on the exclusion and expulsion era, where we talked about more about the railroad workers, about the Exclusion Acts, about indentured servants. And then the fourth class, we talked about the retaliation to this exclusion, which mostly took place in the form of court cases like Wong Kim Ark, Yip Wo v. Hopkins, and Tate v. Hurley. The fifth class, we talked about Asian Americans in World War II, so really focused on the Japanese American incarceration and the 427th Regiment. And then for the sixth class, Professor Franklin Odo, which was one of the original leaders in the Asian American movement, he Skyped in and did a Q&A session and wrapped things up by talking about the Asian American movement. So that's basically the gist of the class. If you have any questions about any of the topics, because I didn't really go much into depth about them, obviously feel free to ask me. And I just want to wrap this up with a quote which I think very much embodies the spirit of ethnic studies. This is from a document that was sort of a manifesto in the Asian American movement. It's called The Emergence of Yellow Power in America. It says, the Yellow Power movement envisages a new role for Asian Americans. It is a rejection of the passive Oriental stereotype and symbolizes the birth of a new Asian, one who will recognize and deal with injustices. The shout of yellow power, symbolic of our new direction, is reverberating in the quiet corridors of the Asian community. Thank you.